It's the Farmer to Farmer podcast, episode 32, and this is your host, Chris Blanchard. My guest today is Rebecca Thistlethwaite, author of The New Livestock Farmer. She currently lives and raises livestock near Hood River, Oregon. She and her husband ran TLC Ranch near Watsonville, California for a number of years. They raised 10,000 broiler chickens every year, 5,000 laying hens, and 300 hogs on 20 acres of irrigated pasture. We discuss the ways that farmers who are focused on livestock, as well as farmers who have livestock as a secondary enterprise, can make the most of their critter-based efforts. Along the way, we get into the importance of matching the scale of your livestock enterprise to the equipment and infrastructure you have on hand, the considerations of selling meat through different outlets and in different ways, and how to make the most of your water, feed, and fencing. This episode was extremely informative. I feel like I learned a ton about how to raise livestock and a bunch of stuff I wish I'd known back in my sheep and chicken days. I hope you enjoy the show and learn as much from it as I did. The Farmer to Farmer podcast is brought to you by Vermont Compost, founded by organic crop growing professionals committed to meeting the need for high quality composts and compost-based living soil mixes for certified organic plant production. VermontCompost.com. The Farmer to Farmer podcast is brought to you by Farmigo CSA Management Software, providing the tools you need to manage your CSA business. Farmigo CSA Management Software has a customizable management system to meet your farm's specific needs. CSAManagementSoftware.com. Rebecca Thistlethwaite, welcome to the Farmer to Farmer podcast.
Hi.
So glad that you could join us today from Hood River, Oregon.
Thank you.
So how's the weather in Hood River in the middle of September?
Oh, it's gorgeous fall days. Warm in the day and cooling down at night.
And Hood River, now you guys are kind of up the Columbia River, a couple of hours from the ocean?
Yeah, probably 3 hours from the ocean. So our climate is a bit more desert-like, high desert climate.
Okay, so you're not the classic Pacific Northwest. It's probably drizzly and rainy there right now kind of place. You guys are a little bit more on the dry eastern side.
Yeah, we're living on the sunny side.
The sunny side. I like that's better than the dry eastern side, isn't it? So, Rebecca, you're the author of The New Livestock Farmer, which just came out from Chelsea Green a couple of months ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah, sure. We used to raise animals in California for a living, and we looked to a lot of great books out there to learn how to do this and augment our knowledge, books by authors such as Joel Salatin and Elliot Coleman and others. But really felt like there wasn't a good book out there that goes over the business aspects of raising and selling livestock, particularly around direct marketing meat. There's so many regulations and hoops you have to jump through and a lot of logistics management that we felt like needed a book around the subject. So my husband and I spent all of last year pretty much writing this book together. He wrote the chapters on how to raise animals, and I wrote the chapters on how to process them and get them to market. And we feel like it's a pretty comprehensive guide of how to direct market meat, and hope that it helps others to do the same.
I like how you say you raised some livestock in California a number of years ago, because it wasn't what I think most of us in the small scale organic world would have gone like, oh, some livestock. You had a lot of chickens and not a small number of pigs.
Yeah, our farm was called TLC Ranch, which actually stood for Taste Like Chicken Ranch, because we started out raising broiler chickens on pasture, and our customers would always rave about the full flavor of our chickens and say, wow, these really taste like the chickens my grandma used to have in her backyard, So we just thought that was funny, that our chicken actually tastes like chicken, and named our farm after that. And then we started raising laying hens and pigs and a little bit of sheep and a small number of cattle as well. So the TLC sort of became more like tender loving care. But chickens and pigs were our mainstay. We raised about 10,000 broilers a year, 5,000 laying hens, and we farrow to finished about 300 hogs a year.
Wow, that's no small amount of meat.
Yeah. We discovered that, there's a certain scale to making money from farming, and we just had incredible demand in the San Francisco Bay Area for our eggs and our meat. So we just continued to scale up till we hit what we felt like was our sweet spot, in which we could direct market the majority of what we produced. We did wholesale a little bit of eggs and also partnered with a couple of CSAs to sell our eggs. But for the most part, I would say 80% of what we produced, we direct marketed to consumers. And that was where we found the best profitability.
And so when you say direct marketing, is that standing at farmers market, handing people chickens, or how did that work?
Yeah, we actually, a couple years into farming, we hired market staff. So it usually wasn't us towards the last few years of farming, standing at the farmers market. We realized that our time was better spent elsewhere, or maybe even taking a day off on the weekends. So we had great farmers market staff, and we went to about 3 farmers markets a week. We looked for the best farmers markets where we could clear, a certain amount of money at that market to make it worth our time. So for us, we had to make at least $1,000 for us to be at a market. And we generally sold anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 per market. And so there was that, and then partnering with a couple CSAs. And then we also partnered with kind of a produce delivery service to offer a mixed meat bundle, which also worked pretty well. And then we sold halves and whole pigs directly to consumers. So
I know a lot of people that do the broilers are actually, very much following that Joel Salatin model where they've got you've got the pens and you're moving the pens every day. Was that something that you were doing?
Yeah, our pen design was developed by a gentleman in Oregon. His name is Robert Plamondon, and it's more of like a mini hoop house where you can actually walk inside of it. We found that was a little bit easier on the birds because the heat didn't accumulate in the pens, and it was easier on our bodies to be able to walk inside of the pen. So that way, if we had to pull a bird out who was injured or sick, or when we went to go harvest the birds, it was a lot easier for us to walk inside of the pen. But yeah, we moved them 1 to 2 times a day. And then our laying hens, we utilized old cotton trailers that were on wheels, like 8 feet wide by 30 feet long, and each cotton trailer could hold up to 500 birds roosting. And at one point we had a dozen of these cotton trailers spread across the pasture, and my husband would move them about every other day with our pickup truck, just hitched directly to the trailer. And then our pigs, we moved around with electric fencing, and they got moved every week or 2.
For those livestock, how many acres were you running?
Amazingly, we didn't have that much acreage. We only had 20 acres of irrigated pasture. And that was year-round, I should say, because this was in California, so we were able to utilize that pasture pretty much year-round, except when it flooded. And then we also had another property that we rented where we kept our breeding stock, so our sows and our boars, and then we would also brood chickens or chicks at this other property. But the majority of our animals were just on 20 acres.
Wow. That is a lot of birds for 20 acres. You must have had, it would almost feel like, and without doing any math on it, it would feel like you were probably really loading that down with quite a lot of fertility.
Yeah. Towards the end of our 6 years on this land, we came to the realization that we were probably applying a little bit too much nitrogen and phosphorus to the land, even though we were moving the animals frequently and resting the pastures. So it probably was a little bit on the excessive side. Our last year, we actually we got rid of broiler chickens, and we reduced our laying hen flock to better manage the manure on the land. But when you irrigate pasture and you have 12 months of grass production, it can actually absorb a considerable amount of nutrients. And our pasture went from, it was a former strawberry field, so there was no fertility left when we first rented it. And by the time we left, we had doubled the organic matter in that pasture, and it was a beautiful pasture. So I think we did some good things to it.
And I assume that you were buying in your feed for the pigs and the chickens. That's not something that you were raising.
No, we aspired to raise our own grain someday, but really the area that we were farming in California didn't have any grain production, and it didn't have equipment, and there really was no land available for grain production. So we did purchase all of our feed, but we also augmented it with brewers' grains from a few different breweries, and then organic produce that we'd pick up from 5 Whole Food stores. That really helped, especially with the pigs, to reduce our feed bill.
That's really great. So kind of helping to close some nutrient loops, even if they weren't necessarily nutrient loops on your own farm. Yeah, it was not only a key part of our financial sustainability and reducing our feed bill, but we also felt good about taking material that otherwise would go to the landfill and generate methane, and instead we were making protein from it and food for people. So it was a good situation. Plus we wholesaled eggs to Whole Food stores, so we'd go and drop off our eggs and then pick up the waste veggies at the same time. So it made use of our truck. Right, really, which I think is such an important thing, especially in small-scale operations, as much as it is in large-scale operations, to optimize your use of any assets that you do own. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, we tried to make all of our routing, whether it was product or feed or anything, we tried to always have the truck full going and coming back to the farm. So just a couple more questions about your production on that farm and just some of the nitty gritty. So were you butchering your own chickens? We were in California and many other states. I think it's about 37 states. They follow a federal law which allows poultry to be processed on farm as long as it's sold directly to the consumer without any USDA inspection. So we set up a very ad hoc, cheap outdoor chicken processing area, basically just with like a pop-up tent and some stainless steel equipment, and then we just put straw down on the ground to collect the water and blood, and then we compost all of that material after processing. But yeah, we'd process usually on Friday and then sell those fresh birds at farmers markets on Saturday and Sunday. So we didn't have to have freezer storage or anything. The four-legged creatures, though, the pigs, the sheep, and the cattle all went to a USDA slaughterhouse. We raised 1,000 birds our first year at Rock Spring Farm, mm-hmm. and butchered them all ourselves and sold them. And they were the best chickens that I've ever eaten. Yeah, I bet. But I always, when I think back on that, I go back to 3 things. I hauled a whole lot of water in an incredibly inefficient way because we didn't have a watering system that went out to the pasture. Mm-hmm. It was a whole lot of killing. And we didn't make any money. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you about all those things in orders. How did you guys manage the water for 5,000 birds? They're like vegetables. They're mostly made out of water. As soon as, when I met my husband, he'd already raised chickens for a few years and kind of dialed in some systems. And he's not a lover of tons of physical labor. And as quickly as possible, he developed solutions to make things more efficient and also not destroy his body. So we plumbed an automatic watering system for all of our animals. And the way that we did that is we took an old cotton trailer
that had actually fallen over, so it was kind of junk, but it just served as a base for some big giant water tanks that we put on top of it, and we plumbed them all together, and then we had bell waters hanging underneath the trailer, so they were shaded, which kept the water cool. And then we actually painted the water tanks black so that they wouldn't grow algae and also keep the water cool. And that worked for both pigs and chickens. For the pigs, we just plumbed nipple waters onto the trailer. And the nice thing about that is we were able to move the water trailer so that the impact would be spread around the pasture, because wherever you have water, you have mud and wallows and, just a big old mess, plus a lot more disease potential. So we would move that water trailer just as often as we moved their housing. And it worked brilliantly, and it was very minimal labor. And I think my husband filled up the tanks once a week, and just every day he'd just give a quick, 1-minute inspection of the waters and make sure they were all working. And that was about it. So he immediately developed solutions to save time and reduce the amount of hauling and stuff like that. He did the same thing with all the feed. We use giant 300 pound range feeders that only had to be filled up once a week. And we also got grain tanks right away so that we could buy feed in bulk and transport and move around feed in large containers instead of dealing with feed sacks thrown over our shoulders and stuff.
You did the water by basically allowing the chickens and the pigs, or at least the laying hens and the pigs, to move to the water. But you were doing the broilers in more of a chicken tractor style setup. How did you get the water out to them?
Same thing. We just ran hoses from these tanks to their chicken tractors, and we hung a plus-on bell water in each chicken tractor, and moved them sort of like an armada across the pasture. We'd have anywhere from 10 to 15 of these all right next to each other, so that we could have like one hose running behind them with smaller offset hoses going to each bell water in each house. So that was all automated as well.
I really like that you mentioned that Jim would go and check all of the different waters to make sure that everything was working right. Because I think that's so important. Anytime you have an automated system, is having a backup mechanism, a way that you're monitoring the performance of the system rather than just trusting it to take care of itself.
Oh, yeah. And, we feel really strongly in that sort of a management intensive farming system. So, there wasn't a lot of physical labor involved, but there was a lot of daily observation and making sure birds were healthy and checking the waters and all of those things we feel is really important, because, every once in a while there would be a hiccup in the system, have a 100-degree day and find out that a bunch of the waters are broken on that one day.
Because that, of course, is the day that the chicken waters break, right?
Of course, it is. And, we did have some occasional losses. We had one situation in the wintertime where a big rainstorm caused our entire pasture to flood while we had a bunch of broiler chickens out there. There was only about an inch of water on the pasture, but broiler chickens are so stupid that they won't stand up in the water. They'll just lie down, with their breasts on the ground. And we lost a bunch of birds that way. So, you have to be out there every single day checking on the animals.
Yeah, I do remember some pretty sloppy rescue efforts inside the Salatin style pens that we had for raising our birds. When you get a few inches of rain, things weren't really pretty. So how about the killing? Was that something that you guys just did yourselves, or did you bring in help with that?
Yeah, I actually had a full-time job at the time, so I didn't get to enjoy the killing myself. I would get off work and then come help with the bagging and labeling. But my husband did it with one hired woman, and they would go through usually 100 to 150 birds on sometimes up to 200 on a given day, just the two of them, with stainless steel scalder, plucker. Well, first kill cones, then the scalder, plucker, and then tables, evisceration tables. And he did it for a few years and finally got sick of it. And we did a little bit of financial analysis looking at his earnings per hour of labor invested, because I think that's an important metric that farmers need to look at for every enterprise is, how labor intensive are those enterprises and what are your earnings per hour? And we realized that he wasn't making enough per hour to justify that enterprise anymore. So that's when we actually decided to drop the broilers and focus more attention on the layers, because there's considerably less labor involved and there's not the weekly killing, which started to get old for my husband, processing thousands and thousands of birds. So, and there was no USDA poultry plant within probably 6 hours of where we live. So it wasn't an option to go anywhere else.
Well, and it's such a problem if you're operating on any kind of a small scale to find somebody who can handle a large enough number of birds in a licensed facility and then be willing even to deal with you at 100 to 125 birds a week. Yeah.
There was a duck processing facility that we talked to, and they wanted 1,000 bird minimum. And we could bring them 1,000 birds, but we couldn't sell 1,000 birds in a weekend to farmers markets. And so then we'd have to get into the whole business of freezing birds and having good vacuum sealing. And so that really wasn't a good choice for us. But I would say the chickens were a good sort of entry-level enterprise for us to start with. They were very low capital. I mean, you can start with chickens with almost nothing. The turnaround is great for cash flow. So I think it's a good way to kind of get your foot in the door. Plus, having chicken at the farmer's market, you can get into pretty much any farmer's market you want, and consumers love chicken. It's the number one consumed meat these days. So it's a great way to establish your customer base. But in the end, it just didn't make sense when there were other things that we could do that had better earning potential.
Well, and I actually spent a day working in a chicken processing plant out in Maine, where we farmed before I farmed in Iowa. And it was amazing how much a little bit of investment on their part really paid off in terms of the efficiency of the butchering operation. Mm-hmm. I think it's one of those things where you have to get the numbers right with mm-hmm. that to justify making the kinds of investments that you need to make mm-hmm. and to make the operation efficient enough to really be able to justify putting the owner's labor back into it, mm-hmm. if that all makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and because we were leasing land and we had a year-to-year lease, it made no sense for us to invest in any sort of real either processing infrastructure or even, winter shelters for the birds that were more permanent, anything like that. It just didn't make any sense for us. So we had to keep everything pretty light and mobile and inexpensive. So that was a drawback for us. There probably were things that we could have done to make the chicken operation more efficient and then make his earnings better. But we kind of racked our brain for years to figure out what we could do, and it wasn't going to happen with a year-to-year lease. So
I think this is a challenge that a lot of people are in, especially as beginning farmers, mm-hmm. that land access issue. And probably, I would think, less of an issue with livestock. You guys weren't certified organic, were you?
Our eggs were certified organic.
Oh, they were? Okay.
Yeah.
So you had to have organic pasture.
Yeah. And the land was organic. It was owned by a nonprofit, and they got all the land certified organic. So that wasn't an issue for us. But I would say just in our travels and interviewing farmers around the country that livestock producers actually have more of a challenge finding land and getting themselves into either a long-term lease or purchase agreement, because with animals, there is some permanent infrastructure that you eventually are going to need, whether it's sorting infrastructure like corrals and head gates and all of those things for when you want to load your animals up onto the trailer, building processing facilities, winter shelter, fencing. All of those things typically require, a long-term lease situation. And that's increasingly hard for beginning farmers and small farmers to be able to find.
Like a lot of beginning farmers, we started off with vegetables and sheep and pigs and chickens, doing layers and broilers. And I remember going to Tom Franson's farm in Northeast Iowa, and Tom Franson is a very well-respected organic hog farmer. And I think you actually write about his livestock handling system in your book. Yeah. And like helping him sort pigs, and you just sorted the pigs, and it was like nothing. I mean, it was so easy. Yeah. And then going back home where we had 4 pigs and trying to load ours up to take them to market. And it ended up being almost a half a day affair. Oh, yeah. At the end of what was a typically exhausting vegetable farming day in October, when there was a ton of work to do to get crops out of the field. And I remember my partner, we'd had 3 of them in the truck. And finally, she starts screaming at this pig, this last pig that wouldn't come along. She's like, "I don't have time for this." And she grabs the pig by the ear and hauls it onto the trailer. And the pig, of course, is just squealing, and she's cussing at the pig. And I was like, this just isn't worth it, It was something we limped through livestock for a number of years, and gradually we dropped the broilers, and then we dropped the laying hens, and then we dropped the pigs, and then we finally got rid of the sheep and just focused on the vegetables. But we were always up against this infrastructure issue of how do I actually make how do I make the livestock efficient when I've got all of these other places where I'm investing my income, where I was taking the profits from the farm, plowing them back into new tractors, new cultivating equipment, new hoop houses. And we just weren't making enough money on the livestock to make it worthwhile. And I think this is a real challenge that a lot of farmers have when you're getting started, because you have to not only do you have to have the land tenure, but you have to have that critical mass of livestock that makes it worth investing in that handling system. Yeah, absolutely. I see a lot of farmers trying, like you mentioned, trying to do too many different animal enterprises, especially at the beginning before they've got that experience, before they've had the opportunity to build the infrastructure. So I recommend, at almost, this is true for everything, but starting out small with fewer species, make your life less complicated, and just try one thing at a time or a couple things at a time, and then do that end of the year analysis where you actually look at your labor investments, and you look at your cost of production per animal species, and see, which one's profitable overall, and also which one is making you the best income, per hour of labor invested. And then you can start honing in on the ones that are most profitable for you, and also that you enjoy as well. If you can't stand raising sheep, for example, that's a species that we struggled with because they always
tested our fencing, we eventually, we eventually just swore them off, like we're never going to raise them again. And actually we're raising them now because we have this amazing deer fence around our entire property that we got a small USDA loan to pay for, but it's a permanent fence and it's 6 feet tall and those sheep can't touch it. You know, we've also got an electric offset wire on the inside of it, so they literally don't touch it. But only now will I consider raising sheep when I have that kind of fencing. So yeah, you have to look at the profitability. You have to look at whether you like the different enterprises, and then hone in on the best mix. And so for us, it was the laying hens and the pigs were our bread and butter. And then we would only raise about 30 sheep a year just so we could have lamb at the farmer's market. And we also raised about 5 Jersey bull calves every other year. And the cattle were really just for mowing down the grass so that it was shorter for the chickens. So, and they were really hands-off, like very, very easy to raise. We honed in on what worked best for us. So even though our customer base wanted us to raise every meat out there, you know, when are you going to raise ducks? When are you going to raise rabbits? When are you going to have more grass-fed beef? We realized that we didn't have to produce everything. And then also we started partnering with a couple neighboring farmers. So we got the majority of the grass-fed beef that we sold at the farmer's market was from a neighbor, Joe Morris, who is an excellent cattleman. He's like a 4th or 5th generation cattleman. He knew what he was doing, much more so than us, and he had thousands of acres of land. So instead of us trying to raise grass-fed beef on 20 acres of land, we partnered with somebody who was better at it. And that turned out to be way more profitable and a lot less headache for us than trying to do it ourselves. So those are the kind of decisions that you have to start making as you get more experience.
So, Rebecca, what I'd like to do now is we're going to take a break and get a word from our sponsors. And then I want to come back and talk with you about how you're going about the determination of what your most profitable enterprises are and what you found from working with a lot of livestock growers over the years makes the difference between a profitable livestock enterprise and one that's just paying the feed bill. The Farmer to Farmer podcast is sponsored by Vermont Compost. Vermont Compost potting soils are a really special product. I used Vermont's Compost Fort V as a blocking mix and potting soil for over 12 years on my farm, and we grew some great transplants with it. I mean, really great transplants year after year. At a time in the organic movement when we're seeing more and more companies jumping on the bandwagon, Vermont Compost is a reminder of the art and the craft of making potting soil. They mix an incredible diversity of ingredients into the compost that forms the basis of their potting soil, incorporating many kinds of manures along with plant materials and food waste to foster structure and aeration in the compost. I love that their Fort V mix even has chips of ocean blue granite in it and kelp for a little smell of the ocean. One thing I have always appreciated about Vermont Compost is their ability to put out a consistent, fantastic product year after year. And in something that's subject to as many variables as market farming, it's nice to have something that you can count on. VermontCompost.com. The Farmer to Farmer podcast is brought to you by Farmigo CSA Management Software, providing the tools you need to manage your CSA business. Farmigo CSA management software is designed from the ground up to manage the CSA you operate, from customer sign-up right through delivery. Farmigo staff will work with you to customize the dashboard for your farm based on the way your CSA works. System setup is free, and the system can be configured for a wide variety of CSA models, from the traditional box plan right through fully modifiable boxes. On the customer side, Farmigo offers a portal for members to sign up, make payments, and access their account to manage vacation holds and site changes, all with the control by the farm over what can be changed and when the changes can be made. On the farmer side, you can send fully customizable confirmation emails and auto responses and generate reports to help you manage everything from harvest and loading the truck right through delivering the CSA shares. And they offer amazing customer support to you at no charge. They'll even call you if you need help. Learn more at csamanagementsoftware.com. All right, and back with Rebecca Thistlethwaite now. Rebecca, we said we were going to talk about how you go about determining what's a profitable enterprise on your farm, particularly when you're dealing with livestock. and then I want to talk a little bit about what are the key elements of profitability in a livestock operation, or maybe I should even say a livestock enterprise. You talked earlier about sitting down with your husband, Jim, and figuring out that the time that he was spending butchering the broilers wasn't paying for itself, and you guys deciding to get rid of that operation. What kind of records were you keeping, and how did you go about that record keeping to make that happen?
Yeah, so we didn't do this all the time, but periodically we would keep logs of our labor. So a couple butchering sessions, we kept track of how much time Jim put into it, and then also how many hours he put into a flock of broilers. So if you have the broilers for 8 to 10 weeks, how many hours did he actually put into that flock, divided by the number of birds to find out how many hours per bird. And so that way we could very easily see, given the revenue that we generated per bird, what that equated to in terms of his hourly wage. And it wasn't that the broilers didn't make any money. It's just that we set a bar for ourselves that we needed to make at least $15 an hour for our time. And the broilers were making less than that. So that was a pretty easy decision for us, topped off with the fact that my husband was just getting thoroughly sick of killing birds.
Yes, I was the bird killer on my farm,
yeah.
And I know how that you kind of. The first few, it's almost kind of fun. Like you're like, ooh, I'm getting in touch with life and death, and then after 600 or 800 birds, it's like okay. Really? Yeah.
And think of doing thousands every summer. It's like, this is too much. So he didn't like it, and he wasn't making enough money per hour. So that was a pretty easy one for us to drop. And then the laying hens, we bought an old egg washer, actually off of a bankrupt turkey farm. Jim picked it up for $100 because it was lying on its side, kind of all decrepit and rusty, and fixed it up. And that made our egg operation scalable. So before that, I think we had maybe 400 hens, and we were washing the eggs by hand. Literally every evening, we'd sit there, watch television, and have buckets of eggs in front of us in a wet rag, and we'd be washing it by hand.
So what kind of television is the best for washing eggs?
I think we were watching that show 24. I don't know if you remember that, but
oh yeah, that was a pretty intense show. That
exactly.
could actually be okay. Yeah,
and it was a rare time in our lives when we had cable. So sat there and watched TV and washed eggs. But realized quickly as our daughter started growing and commanding more of our attention that we weren't going to be able to sit there and wash eggs for a couple hours every night. She wanted us to interact with her. So we found this egg washer and fixed it up, and then we were able to get thousands of birds. But the interesting thing about the egg washer, and I kind of use this as an illustration of finding the correct scale, is that egg washer was perfect when we had about 2,500 layers, but it was too small when we had 5,000 birds. We ended up we hired a couple employees about 3 years into the business, and these two guys would spend 8 hours a day between the two of them running the egg washer, washing and packing eggs. And then we looked at the math. Unfortunately, we waited till the end of the year to do the math. We should have been doing it more often, and realized that we could have bought a brand new egg washer with a much higher capacity for the amount of money that we spent on these two employees. But it was too late at that point. We'd already spent the money on these employees. And that's when we decided to scale back down to 2,500 birds, because that was the sweet spot for this egg washer, where we wouldn't spend more than a couple hours a day on the egg washer. So you have to look at, it's sort of a combination of your land resources, your infrastructure, your equipment, and find the appropriate scale. I'll give you another example of finding that scale. So we used to buy our pig and our chicken feed in 50-pound sacks when we first started. And then we quickly scaled up to tote sacks, which were, I think, 300 pounds or 300 to 500-pound tote sacks that they would bring out on a flatbed truck.
Right.
And then we scaled up to bulk feed because we could get the cheapest price for our feed if we went to bulk. But bulk feed meant 24 or 26 tons at a time. Otherwise, the truck wouldn't come out to our farm because it was a couple hours away from the feed mill. So we had to scale up the number of animals to consume that much feed in a month, because you basically don't want to be storing feed for longer than a month, or it starts to go rancid.
Because once it's ground, it's going to get rancid on you.
It'll start to go rancid. So that meant that we had to go buy some big feed tanks, which my husband is a whiz at going around to derelict and defunct farms and offering farmers, a couple $100 for their old equipment. So we got those for a great price. I think we had a 11-ton feed tank, a 6-ton, and a 7-ton one. And set those up, and then we had to make sure the driveway was passable for the feed truck, which wasn't always easy in the wintertime especially, and create kind of a pad for the feed truck to go and auger all the feed into the tanks. So we had to build that infrastructure, and then we had to have the right number of animals to go through that amount of feed. So I'm constantly talking to farmers about, our feed bill is too much. And I say, well, where are you getting your feed? Oh, well, I'm going down to my local feed store and I'm buying, 10, 50-pound sacks at a time. I'm like, well, that's your problem. Number one is, you're not valuing your time. You're driving to the feed store once a week, and you're buying the most expensive feed you could possibly be buying because you're buying it at retail in small quantities. And,
right.
There's all that labor invested of hauling around feed sacks and hurting your back and stuff. So,
well, not to mention that whole, pulling the right string on the feed sack. That took me 2 years just to figure out which was the right way to open that.
Yeah. So when we consult with other farmers, that's usually water and feed and fencing are the three main things that we help farmers deal with. And right away, we noticed that on, about 90% of the animal farms that we visited, that they don't have those things right. And they're doing, really inefficient things, not really valuing their time. And often cases, doing things that are really hard on their body or hard on their truck or their equipment, and spending retail, buying feed at retail price, basically. So you have to figure out, can you scale up to get to the point where you can start buying feed in bulk, where you can automate your watering systems, where you can invest in better fencing and handling equipment, and buy a livestock trailer instead of throwing the pigs into the back of your minivan, and, all of those things. And that's when you get to that scale that I think for most farmers, you'll start to see your profitability increase. But on the other side, you also have to have the market for that amount of meat or that amount of eggs. So that's a whole nother component that I haven't even discussed.
We found this. You take eggs to farmers market and people are really excited about the eggs. Mm-hmm. But it very quickly turned into, for us, we ran into handling problems with the eggs. How do we get enough eggs to farmers market safely in combination with our vegetables? And then, even with the chickens, when we had this issue where we did most of our marketing in Minnesota. Our farm was in Iowa, so we were crossing state lines. And how do we get people out to the farm? And there was a whole lot of juggling that went on to try to make that marketing work. And I think it was really well, God, I know you're not supposed to be able to have multiple weak links in an operation, but I think it was very close to our weak link in our livestock production, was that when we scaled up the eggs to a point where they became efficient, it actually pushed us into the wholesale marketplace. And then that wholesale, we were selling primarily to one account. They took a hard right turn and said, we can't afford to buy your eggs anymore. We want to buy pre-cracked eggs from the wholesale distributor. We don't have time to crack eggs. Yeah. So that actually, we were left sitting on a whole bunch of hens that we had nothing to do with. Let's talk about that marketing and evaluating your market, especially in light of the fact that natural and organic meats and eggs are so much more widely available than they were even 5 years ago now.
Yeah, that's true. There's certainly a lot more competition now than even when we were farming. And, we had a very special marketplace. I mean, we were within a couple hours of the San Francisco Bay Area, which is, considered sort of a mecca of enthusiastic customers who have money. So I do realize that, the prices that we commanded there are not going to fly in a lot of this country. But, the key is, and you alluded to it, don't put all your eggs in one basket and, relying on one market to move the majority of your eggs was problematic for you. And we ran into that a couple times early on. We were working with a butcher who was processing all of our pigs for us and selling the pork. And then he found another supplier who could provide him pigs for, a couple dollars a pound less, and just completely dropped us when we had several hundred piglets on the ground growing, So we quickly had to regroup and start selling retail cuts of pork at the farmer's market. So, we had a variety of outlets from selling whole and half animals, what people call freezer meat or bulk meat, to selling retail cuts, to doing these meat bundles with a CSA. So there's quite a variety of great markets out there. I talk about them in my book, from creating your own meat CSA to potentially partnering with an existing vegetable CSA that has a well-established clientele and adding like a mixed meat bundle onto their CSA. But in terms of profitability, we discovered that half and whole animals were the most profitable for us and required the least amount of logistics, the least amount of having to store meat. The more you have to store meat, the more either freezer space you have to have or that you have to rent. And it also means a lot of handling, like going and getting meat to bring to the farmer's market each week. Whereas if you sell a whole or half animal and your customer picks up that packaged meat directly from the butcher, you're not handling it at all. So that cuts out a lot of your costs, and you're also not sitting at the farmer's market all day. So that is a great market. There's sort of a ceiling to how many animals you can move that way. But I think farmers starting out especially should try to move as many animals as they can through friends and family networks and selling half and whole animals.
You mentioned pricing, Rebecca, and I think a lot of times people are tempted to go after the way that's going to make them the most cash dollars, which is probably selling those animals by the piece at farmers market and capturing all of that retail upside on every cut that you can. How do you go about setting pricing? I mean, you're saying that you'd rather see beginning farmers focus on selling wholes and halves or quarters, and how do you go about that pricing piece? How do you decide how much each animal costs to produce, what kinds of overhead you need to allocate to the animals, and then how much of a margin you're going to get?
Yeah. So I think figuring out your cost per animal is essential at the beginning before you ever set a price. You need to know how much it costs you. So, you can take all of your direct costs and then a percentage of your overhead, kind of depending on what that enterprise is, what percent of overhead you should attribute to that enterprise. And then come up with, it doesn't have to be, down to the penny, but a pretty good ballpark cost per head. And then you can easily figure out about how many pounds of meat or saleable product you can get from that animal. I have a table in my book that shows, what the percent yield is per animal species. So say you have a sheep and your final yield is, let's say it's 50% of the original live weight. So, you have a 100-pound animal, so you end up with 50 pounds. No, let's say 40 pounds of saleable product. And if that animal costs you $200, so it's 200, divided by 40 pounds. So that is the price that you need to make. That's your break-even price.
That's your break-even. That's probably before you're getting yourself some labor or getting any compensation for your labor or your risk or your investment at that point.
Yeah, usually, if you have hired labor, that would be built into that price. But your personal labor, some farmers add that into their costs, and other farmers wait until their net profits to pay themselves. So, your break-even price, say you want to get 30% net, which is what you think will cover your labor investment, and give you a little money to put away in the bank. You can go even higher. It's perfectly fine to set whatever percentage you feel you deserve. I would just caution farmers not to make it too low. I mean,
is there a percentage that you recommend?
No less than 30, because if you're not able to put away money, for future investments, then you're never going to be able to grow your business. And if you're not paying yourself, then you're better off not farming at all and saving your money for other investments. So at least 30. And, grocery stores charge 50 to 60% margin, so there's no reason why you couldn't do the same. The thing is, you obviously have to test it out in your market and see if it'll fly. And if it won't, you have to adjust it accordingly. Unfortunately, I see way too many farmers coming up with prices arbitrarily just based on their competition or what they see in the grocery store. I live in an area right now where I probably wouldn't bother selling eggs because there are so many hobby and backyard producers selling eggs for $3 or $4 a dozen. And I know that there's no profit in that. So that's not something that I would want to compete against. And it's really unfortunate how many people, don't charge enough to cover their costs and give themselves a profit, because it just hurts everybody else. But I encourage all the listeners out there, please do not base your pricing on what you see in the grocery store.
Yeah.
Base it on your actual cost of production plus a profit margin. But that said, if your costs of production are ridiculous because you're only raising, say you're only raising 5 pigs a year, and your cost per head is much higher because you have to take that small number of animals and divide it against your total overhead and, all your land costs and all of that, then your costs are going to be very high, and it's unlikely that consumers are going to be willing to pay for that. And that's where, finding the appropriate scale is important to spread those costs out amongst more animals. Like if you're raising 1,000 broiler chickens and you up it to 5,000, your costs are not going to go up that much. Your overhead, your direct costs will, obviously your feed bill will be much higher, but it's not going to take you that much more time, and your overhead really shouldn't go up. So that's going to mean that your cost per bird is going to be a lot cheaper. And that's where you're going to be able to start to find some of your profitability. And okay, so that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
But I think that's good. I mean, I think it's a question that deserves kind of a long-winded answer, because it is. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, there's a lot of other elements that go into profitability, but it really all does come down to price. I mean, you could be the most inefficient producer in the world and have the crappiest watering system and the lowest feed conversion ratio and spend all of your time chasing sheep that are out. But if you can charge $10,000 for a lamb, it doesn't matter. Right. So, I mean, it really does come down to pricing, and it's the same thing in vegetables. I mean, you know, and nailing that price is really, I think, what allows you to optimize both the number of animals that you're selling, or the number of units of whatever it is that you're selling, and the profitability per unit. I mean, those two things have to go together. I mean, obviously, you're going to sell more eggs at $4 a dozen than you're going to sell at $6.
Yeah, and a lot of animal producers are attracted to the high retail prices that they see on cuts of meat. You know, we could charge, $26 a pound for lamb loin chops, or, $30 a pound for beef tenderloin. But that doesn't mean that you're going to actually make more money on that animal, because you have significantly more costs involved with getting your animals fully processed. Not only do you have to pay for all the processing, the slaughter and the butcher and the packaging and the labeling and the cold storage and the transportation of that meat and the cold storage back at your farm. And typically you have to have a license to be able to store meat on your farm. So you have to go through some hoops to do that. But there's your marketing costs as well. Driving to the farmer's market, setting up, paying the stall fees, paying the insurance, all of that. So,
well, and the risk, I think, that's involved in selling at retail, because that's a lot of what the margin that a retailer gets is for the possibility that their food is going to go bad in the meantime, or that tenderloins aren't going to be as popular as you thought they were, or that you still have to figure out what the heck you're going to do with the beef liver.
Yeah, with the rest of the animal, and there is some loss involved. We would typically either use those thawed out packages to trade with other farmers at the market to get stuff that we didn't grow, or we would give those to our market staff to take home as just like their bonus. So it wasn't really a big loss for us, but there is, there's rainy days where you're sending someone to market, or you're standing there at the market and you only sell a couple $100 worth of product. So now you got to lug all that product back, stick it back in the freezer. Every time you pull a package out of the freezer and stick it in a cooler and lug it to market and then bring it back means you're degrading the quality of that package. So after it goes to market a couple times, you're probably going to have to eat it. So take all of those things and that potential loss, and you can get rid of all of that if you sell halves and wholes. So especially when you don't have the number of animals to go to the farmer's market, you have to have a lot of animals go to the market, because you have to have good selection for, however long that market season is. So that may require quite a number of animals. But, if you've got less than 10 head of beef or 30 head of sheep, or probably 20 head of pigs or less, you are much better off selling them as halves and wholes or quarters to people, and save your time instead of sitting at the farmer's market.
Rebecca, you said earlier in the interview, you mentioned 3 things that you end up helping farmers with. And I'm going to assume that these are probably 3 important keys to profitable livestock production then, is the water, the feed, and the fencing. One of the things I really love in your book, because I'm always all about capacity, how much am I going to need? And you actually break down how much water per head of livestock you're going to need every day for all of the different species that you cover. And you cover pretty much, I mean, I couldn't think of anything that I'd want to raise that you didn't cover in your book. What are the other considerations with regards to water besides the labor saving that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's the temperature of the water. So animals will not consume really hot water. So that can be really problematic in the summertime, especially if your water lines are on top of the ground and are heating up under the sun, or if you use water troughs that just sit there without any sort of recirculation, they can get really hot. And if the animal is consuming less water, it means it's not going to process its feed as efficiently. And if it's a breeding animal, if it's, a pregnant female, it can have gestational issues if it's not consuming enough water. So that's really essential. And then there's also the wintertime issues. You live in Wisconsin, so I imagine you've ran into this, but a lot of farmers run into frozen water lines. So you have to come up with a way to keep your water thawed out so that the animal will continue to consume lots of water. And then, another issue is water quality. So if your animal's drinking water that's dirty or been sitting there for a while, or if it's like an open pond or a water trough that's full of algae, that can actually be toxic to the animal. So you may have to put some sort of aerator in your pond or in your water trough to keep the water quality up.
Okay. And what about feed? Because obviously that's the major input cost on most livestock. Anything that you're not just grazing, anything you're feeding grain to, you're going to be spending more money on the feed than you spend on anything else, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So, because we raise pigs and chickens, which are monogastrics, they're not ruminants, they can only get a small percentage of their diet from, the vegetation that's growing. Or in the case of the pigs, we'd run them under oak trees to eat acorns, but that's only a portion of their diet. So they are going to have to be supplemented with outside feed. And that feed bill can make or break your operation. It's typically 50 to 60% of your cost of production, sometimes even more if you're not having good, feed conversion ratio. So that impacts a lot of things, from the choice of breed that you use, and how efficiently it converts feed, and also how quickly it grows. It impacts, your logistics of handling and delivering the feed. It could be very labor intensive to put feed out for your animals. And it's often the thing that I see make people get rid of animals is the cost of feed. I remember one year, our biggest year of production, our feed bill over the course of the year was $250,000.
Wow, and that was on how many dollars gross?
That was on around $500,000 gross.
Wow, so 50% of your gross sales were going to paying for the feed bill.
Yep. And that's one of those things that really keeps you up at night. When you're past due on a bill that's $25,000 and you're like, how am I going to pay for this? It's so stressful. So,
well, and if you're looking at $250,000 and you can make a 1% improvement in your feed conversion, that's a substantial adjustment to your bottom line.
Absolutely. Yeah. And here's the deal. If you're spending the good majority of your day doing chores, what I call working in the business, you're never going to have time to kind of step back and figure out how to make those bigger improvements, or how to work on efficiency, or how to find a cheaper feed source or a better way of conveying it to your animals. So that's why I talk about in my book how you have to figure out how to get your chores down to no more than 4 hours a day of your time, because then that will free up the time for you to work on the business, which is, those bigger scale improvements, the marketing, the financial management, the things that CEOs and business managers spend time on. So one of the first things we help farmers do is how to make their chores more efficient. So that's the fencing, that's the feed, logistics, and the watering, automating the watering. And then once you get those chores to a manageable level, then you can kind of step back and look at some cost-saving measures like finding a better feed supplier or buying your feed in bulk or using more waste feed products. So we started picking up, spent grains and waste produce from grocery stores, but that took us a few years to get to that point. First we had to buy a truck with a liftgate, a big flatbed truck with a liftgate, and then we had to get these big garbage cans on wheels that we would bring to the grocery stores, and they would dump, the Whole Foods would dump all their waste produce into these. And then we had to hire a driver to go and pick it up twice a week, and all of those things took a lot of time. But ultimately, they allowed us to reduce our feed expenses a lot, especially for the pigs, and then our profitability just shot way up on the pigs. So it was worth it.
And then what about fencing? What are the key elements to think about with profitability with regards to fencing?
We're real strong believers in electric fencing, and especially when you are first starting out and perhaps you're leasing land, or maybe you own land, but you're not exactly sure what enterprises you're going to do for the long term. So instead of going out and spending tens of thousands of dollars on permanent fencing, why not spend hundreds of dollars on portable electric fencing? And that just gives you so much more flexibility for moving your animals and kind of designing the layout of your farm. So with electric fencing, that not only allowed us to really easily move animals and quickly too. It would take us, 30 minutes to set up a new pig fence area, and that would be it for a couple weeks. So a lot less labor. It also would allow us to rotate our animals we had a couple other vegetable farmers leasing land on the same ranch. So we could run our animals on their vegetable fields after they were done harvesting. For our animals to glean all the waste produce and fertilize their fields. So electric fencing made that possible. And then when we pulled up stakes and we left that property after leasing for 6 years, we were able to just pull up all the electric fencing and sell it. So we were able to, regain some of our investment. Whereas if you built a permanent fence, that obviously couldn't happen. So, but now that we own a piece of land in Oregon and we have a permanent fence, I'm thrilled of having a permanent fence now. But I do think it requires either a long-term lease or ownership of land before you make that investment. But now that we have a permanent fence, we do all of our cross fencing with electric fence. So we have a electric offset wire on our permanent deer fence, just on the inside, a single strand, and we clip onto that when we're setting up our cross fencing, and it's really easy.
So you're not having to use a portable fence charger anymore. You're able just to tie into the one that's always set up.
Yep, and it's a plug-in charger that's running the perimeter. So it's much higher powered. So
got a lot of juice in there.
Yeah, when our animals touch it, they don't go near it again. So we're not changing.
How about you? When you touch it, do you go near it again? That's the thing I don't like about electric fence. It hurts. I know. In all my years of farming, I have yet to touch an electric fence. My husband, on the other hand, has touched it many times, but that's what muck boots are for, because you can literally stand on your electric fence to walk over it and you won't get a shock. Okay. That's the tip of the day right there. I like that. So, Rebecca, would you tell us a little bit? Now, you alluded to you're not farming on that piece of ground where you were in California. TLC Ranch is not in business anymore. Can you tell us why you transitioned out of that and about where you've ended up now?
Sure. Yeah, it was a combination of factors, but primarily our land tenure situation was year-to-year lease, and we looked for 6 years to purchase land somewhere within a couple hours of the San Francisco area, so we can continue to market there. And we really could not find anything. A lot of the good land around there is used for high-value vegetables and strawberries, and we couldn't compete with those prices. And they wanted $50,000 an acre, so that really wasn't an option. And year-to-year leases were starting to drain on us. We couldn't build handling and sorting infrastructure like corrals and such to make it easier to load our animals. We wanted to build a winter barn, and we couldn't do that. So that really kind of sealed the deal for us. And then the other factor that finally made us throw in the towel there was crime. Our last year production, we had 300 laying hens stolen. We had a sow, wow, a prize sow, and all her piglets stolen. We had our ATV stolen, a bunch of other things. It was, a pretty tough area to farm in. So
yeah, that would kind of take the fun out of it right there.
Yeah, the fun was gone by then. So we decided we wanted to live somewhere a little bit smaller, more rural, more family friendly. And I grew up in Oregon, so it wasn't a hard decision for us to come back to Oregon. So we were able to finally purchase some land. So we have 5 acres now, and I'd call it more of a farmstead, not fully a homestead, because we do sell some products. I have a little vegetable stand in town that I operate in the summertime, and we do sell a few animals, mainly through bartering and trading with neighbors. And then we put up a ton of food and are feeding ourselves. So that's great. And now we also have the time and energy to explore some funner projects. Like we're building a smokehouse, and we built a curing room. So we're dabbling with curing our own meat now, and doing kind of more of a permaculture operation. So, raising worms for compost, and ducks in our pond, and running pigs under the oak trees to eat acorns. And yeah, it's fun.
That's really
fun's back.
It's kind of nice to step back and sometimes and find the joy in something rather than just having it be the grind of trying to make a profit at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we still think about raising animals again commercially. We have a few neighbors who have land that aren't using it and have talked to us about, putting sheep or cattle out on their land. And then where I live, it's primarily oak savanna, so it'd be great for running pigs on acorns. And we've ran a few batches of American guinea hogs exclusively on acorns, and then cured the hams from those. And the ham is just exquisite. So, that's something that we sort of ponder. But then, the practical side of me comes back, and I think about all the regulations that we'd have to jump through if we wanted to do any, meat curing or value-added products. So we'll see. We'll see what our future holds.
That's great. So right now, I know that your future holds a lightning round, like we do at the end of every show. So what's your favorite tool on the farm?
I would say the scythe, the European scythe that we have for chopping down cover crop.
Was that something that you used in your commercial operation, or is that something that you're just using now?
That's one of the fun things we get to play with now that we don't have the pressure of farming for our income.
Great. And what's your favorite livestock species?
Pigs, without a doubt.
And is there a particular variety of pigs or a particular breed of pigs that you like best?
The American guinea hog is our new favorite pig because it is a great forager and you can finish it completely on acorns. They don't beg for food like other pigs and are really self-sufficient.
And what is it that you like about pigs?
You know, they're smart. They have great personalities. The American guinea hogs in particular are like big cats. They roll over for belly rubs. They're just the sweetest things ever. And they're actually really easy to fence in with electric fencing. We only have to use a single strand of electric fencing. So they're way easier than most other species.
Yeah, that nice big snout and the nice firm contact with the soil is really a great thing about pigs, isn't it? And if you could choose a farmer superpower, what would you choose?
Oh gosh, being able to put thoughts in people's heads, being able to plant desire for our products in consumers' heads. They'll walk by our farm stand and just have to eat what we're growing.
Be more than happy to pay $24 for that
exactly.
For that lamb chop,
not
right?
even blink an eye when they pull their checkbook out. Just sign it over.
I like it. And if you could go back in time and tell your beginning farmer self one thing before you got into all of this stuff, what would you tell yourself?
That it's not all rainbows and unicorns. That it's really hard. That if you don't want to work 12, 14-hour days, 7 days a week, it's not the lifestyle for you. So get ready for some serious hard work.
Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us on the Farmer to Farmer podcast today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. So wrapping things up here, I'll say again that this is episode 32 of the Farmer to Farmer podcast, and that you can find the notes for this show at farmertofarmerpodcast.com by looking on the episodes page or just searching for Thistlethwaite. You like how I made that sound really easy? Her name's spelled Thistlethwaite, or you can just enter 032 in the search bar on the episodes page. If you enjoy the podcast, I think you would also enjoy my weekly email newsletter, The Flying Rutabaga. The Flying Rutabaga runs the gamut from practical templates for delegation to guidelines for watering transplants. You can sign up at farmertofarmerpodcast.com or purplepitchfork.com. Also, if you enjoy the show, it would be great if you would pop over to iTunes and leave us a review or make a comment on the show notes or tell your friends on Facebook. These reviews and referrals are the bread and butter of making this show available to an ever wider group of listeners. It's worth noting that the show does take a substantial amount of time to produce. Our sponsors, like Vermont Compost and Farmigo CSA Management Software for this episode, and Fertrell, Osborne Seed Company, Second Cut Media, and Audible for previous shows, really support this work. Accessing their web pages through the show notes page and the sponsorship page on my website provides them with a way to measure your engagement. And of course, so does mentioning that you hear their ad on the Farmer to Farmer podcast. Please let them know. It would mean a lot to me. You know what else? I'd love to hear your suggestions for guests on the show. I know a lot of things, but I know that I don't know all of the great farmers out there. Please visit farmertofarmerpodcast.com and use the contact form to tell me who you'd like to hear. You know, we just went over 50,000 downloads for this show all together this last week. That's really great. I want to thank everybody for all of the support. I've really gotten so much great feedback about this. I really have had so many generous guests. I mean, every now and then I just kind of go, wow, this is really cool. And it couldn't be really cool without you listening to the show. Thank you very much. Be safe out there and keep the tractor running.